Hello, everyone. My name is Jean de Premont. I'm here in this virtual room with Professor Tony Carty. Professor Tony Carty and myself have planned a series of dialogues, as we call them, on fundamental and contemporary questions of international law, of legal research, of legal history, and all kinds of other humanistic controversies. This is our first meeting. We will be today focusing on academic publishing, on the practice of reviewing, and this will also bring us to raise the question about what it is to do legal scholarship. So that's the topic for today, and as I've just said, we will kick off with the more concrete, albeit fundamental, question of reviewing, the practice of reviewing in contemporary academia. And I'd like to start by raising a question and ask to Tony the following question. I mean, obviously, Tony, today reviewing is really a very central practice in our job. I mean, there's hardly a single day where we are not reviewing one another. We constantly solicited to review the work of others. When we publish, we have to subject ourselves to this dreadful peer review process. I wonder whether this is a practice that was as central when you started your career. I mean, I remember, in this book by Cassese about the Masters of International Law, where he interviews some people he identified as key figures, there is this interview of Jennings, who remembers that he finished his LLM thesis at Cambridge, had a word with McNair, and then McNair sent the manuscript to New York, and the manuscript was published in the American Journal of International Law 2 months later. So Jennings got his master thesis on the Caroline incident published in the American Journal of International Law just by having a chat with McNair. That was a long time ago. Today, this would be unimaginable. How were things in terms of reviewing, peer reviewing, when you started your career, Tony?
Well, I think it was still the same. I mean, Jennings was about 25 years ahead of me, but I think it was much the same in Cambridge. Actually, the origin of the decay of international law is that Clive Parry had himself contributed to the Mellon Shield lectures publication, and he got in touch with Gillian White, who was the editor in Manchester, and put her onto my work and my manuscript, and said to her fairly directionally, "This is something you should publish." And that was the history of it. So it's much the same. And I know that she gave it to nobody else to look at. And she had a number of hesitations herself. And I know from the time that I was in Cambridge that whenever a colleague, a student colleague, produced a piece of work, a master's dissertation that was considered good, Jennings would send it to Waldock in Oxford, and Waldock would approve it, and it would appear in the British Yearbook. And I think that this was maybe a different world, because in those days, this was before mass education. And when I was in Cambridge, there were about 3 or 4 PhD students in international law, and very, very few master's degree students. And I won't say that the selection process was more rigorous in those days than it is now, but it was certainly more intimate. So everybody knew everybody else. So I think that Waldock would simply have assumed that Jennings would not recommend somebody who was going to be an embarrassment.
Mm-hmm.
And the same. So it was. I believe that this was an ideal world where you were accepted into the circle and trusted, and by others in the circle who trusted you, and you were then given the encouragement and the confidence to proceed. And I have never really been prepared to move outside that frame myself. And while I have nominally, apparently published articles in so-called referee journals, they have always been surreptitiously introduced by friends who encouraged the publication and wanted them. Now, my view of the situation now, from my experience on reviewing myself, but also being on a few boards, but also being, more importantly, on promotion and tenure committees, is that the whole exercise has become quite sinister. I mean, blind peer review, in my view, really means blind. There are so many young scholars involved who want to progress into academia, writing about so many different things. And those who are managing the journals and managing faculties are too busy to know who these people are in any personal or intimate way, and to be familiar with what they are doing. And so the work is really just sent off to some kind of robotic exercise, which is very haphazard. And I think that while I think it is probably not common that scores are settled or vendettas are fought, I think that definitely prejudice, academic prejudice, intellectual prejudice enters very profoundly into the whole process, and cannot be monitored. And so I think the whole thing has become really quite frightening and scary for young scholars who then try to find ways around it as best they can. So,
and you speak of this intellectual prejudice. What do you mean by that?
Well, I give a concrete illustration which may appear to be controversial, but there are a number of topics, well, that, for instance, if you to write about, I mean, in my opinion, there's been some controversy and some difficulty about writing about unequal treaties in relation to China in the 19th century. And the Opium Wars, the Treaty of Nanjing, the Treaty of Tianjin. I mean, I've had young scholars working in this area, and then I have seen how their work has been reviewed and rejected for journals. And I think that the people who are writing these reviews are probably acting in good faith, but there is clear prejudice against China and Chinese history here, in my opinion. And I think this would be quite common over a range of subjects. If you are writing articles about the Ukraine, the Russian, the emotions are aroused, and people, prejudice comes into it. To quite a serious degree. It's something that I would come back to later, because I think that this is becoming a central issue, Eurocentrism. This is one example. I mean, there could be many others. I mean, another young student I know wrote a study on natural law foundations for international law. And on this occasion, I didn't have full control over the whole process of the examination. But the examiner was a professor. One of the examiners chosen by the faculty was a professor of jurisprudence, not an international lawyer, in the Hart tradition, positivist tradition. And he really created havoc here. And from his point of view, I'm sure he was perfectly sincere. And actually, there's something quite profound here, because I think the difference is that between himself as a Hartian positivist and this young American student who's basically evangelical Christian in his outlook, these differences are not really bridgeable. And they usually have to be resolved through some kind of compromise, which involves the examiner fading away or the student being faded out. I think that this is fundamentally very significant, quite apart from the fact that from the more personal elements. It seems to me obvious that blind peer reviewing is, by the metaphor blind, is actually means everything that one would expect it to mean, and not simply, which I think is also highly problematic, the idea that people cannot be trusted to judge fairly or competently people they know. I mean, I was at a meeting of one of the very few journals that I'm allowed to enter. We were discussing who should review a particular topic, and I pointed to one person in the room and I said, well, obviously this is a subject on which, you know, X is a world authority. And he said, oh, but I cannot possibly review this article because I know the person. We've turned full circle from a community of scholars who trust one another to a community, well, not a community, a mass of scholars who don't trust one, who operate on a principle of distrust. Blind peer review means distrust, an attempt to eliminate bias as something which is definitely bound to be already there. So I think that we have got ourselves into quite a mess, because it then becomes fundamental. If you go to the appointment, promotion, tenure, appointment committee, which I've been on in a leading university, and probably two leading universities for more than 10 years, very, very tedious exercise. Basically, the whole process is simply one of ticking boxes. I mean, is this a peer-reviewed journal? Whereabouts is it in the hierarchy of peer-reviewed? How many times is the article cited? This is all robotic exercise. And if you try to challenge, as I have done on a number of occasions, a particular judgment and say, well, I have actually read this article and I don't think it's much use, then the reaction of the committee will be, well, we don't read the articles because we don't know anything about the subject. We simply have to go on whether or not it is in a robotically rated or computer rated journal. I mean, the whole process is, I think it's very serious. Our tradition has lost its way, and I think that it does have profound philosophical and well, I would imagine not simply philosophical explanations, but in terms of sociology of knowledge, there really is a need to very, very much review this whole exercise. And I don't think I think it's dehumanizing for the young people who are being put through it.
I mean, Tony, I couldn't share more your reservations and resentment. And I must say, I had the opportunity to voice my concern in a few places. I mean, especially what you call this false claim to eliminate biases, which is actually, it brings us back to the old project of modernity. I think it's again the legal literature trying to mimic the scientific model. I mean, it's still this old project of social sciences haunting legal academia, just like footnoting and all the rest. And I think it has indeed generated a monster, as you've just put it, a robotic monster. I mean, I must say, I don't think there is anything to celebrate about peer review. I'm using this expression because the other day on these social media, we all love so much, there was like tweets about we need to celebrate peer review. And this deeply shocked me, because I don't think there is anything to be celebrated. I mean, peer review is first, and I think you put it in better term, it's inherently violent. It's very violent. It trashes the work of young person. It destroys career. It destroys life and self-confidence, and it destroys ideas. which might be the worst. So first, it's very violent, and it's also, and I think, as you put it, it's extremely conservative. Uh, um, and the thing is, in a way, it's inherent because to be a good peer reviewer, or to be deemed a good peer reviewer by the journal editors, you must be violent and you must be conservative. I mean, you call this a sort of conformism. If you send a review and say, great piece, I love it, they'll never contact you anymore. They won't give you your book voucher. No, to be deemed a good peer reviewer, you have to be super critical. And so the whole process is meant to be violent and conservative. You have to enforce the practices of the profession. Like, the common practices we all know. Your article must start with a claim. Your article must start by spelling out the structure. Your article must situate your claim in the broader environment.
Yeah.
Your article must reference the existing scholarship. I mean, all this which the peer reviewer will enforce.
Yeah.
You have to do it. As a peer reviewer, when you're asked and invited by a journal, you have to do this. And so it's terribly constraining. I mean, this is the conformism that you were speaking about. It's terribly reactionary. And the worst of that is that this has even been it's now embedded in the consciousness of the entire profession. Authors will evil they will self-censor, they will censor themselves
Of course.
even before submitting anything to a journal.
Of
So
course.
there is a sort of pre-peer review implemented by the authors themselves as they anticipate the censorship that is going to come. So there is a sort of self-censorship prior to the peer review. So it's a horrible thing. And as you said, and it is blind. And that's one of the most shocking thing of all, the fact that it's blind, it's anonymous. So we have here a terrible violence,
Exactly.
which is, I like you, I don't see why we should hide the names of those who destroy career, life, self-confidence, and ideas. Uh, no, I think that's something really, I think it's, you cannot justify the anonymity of the whole process. And the worst is that editors, they hide behind this. They always say, well, it's not our decision, it's the decision of the anonymous peer reviewer.
Exactly.
This is terrible. And that brings me to another shocking aspect of it, is the idea that this anonymous peer reviewer is elevated into the position of a judge. When you do this peer review online, you're asked publishable, non-publishable, minor revision, or major revision. But no, I think you should just give an advice, and the editor takes her or his responsibility. I
Exactly.
don't think the peer reviewer should not be a judge. And you see that the figure of the judge is also haunting the journal business, because we have elevated, we've made these peer reviewers into judges, whereas they shouldn't be. The judge should be the journal editor,
Exactly.
taking his or her responsibility for rejecting an article. And so, yeah, I'm on the same page. I think this is all very shocking, and people continue to worship this peer review process. I can't. I mean, I must say, long time ago, I had some editorial responsibility, and I remember I took pride in generalizing this practice. I remember working for a CUP journal at the time. We did implement the Scholar One, which is the robotic phase of this peer review process. And I remember at the time I was very enthusiastic, and I now feel bad about it, because I think this whole practice is actually pretty shocking. And so I share all what you've said. I mean, I maybe one last thought on this, and as you already touched on, it really brings many fundamental questions about what it is to do scholarship. But I wish we could abandon the format of the journal article. I think we should return to the essay,
Yeah.
the idea of an essay,
Yeah.
and move away from these practices of have a claim, situate your claim, relate your claim to existing scholarship, which is it's the manifestation of the conformism you mentioned. But anyway, so that's we're on the same page on this. Um, and that brings, yeah, as you said, lots of questions about what it is to do scholarship. What is scholarship?
Even a legal dimension to it in terms of human rights, though I wouldn't count on the European Court of Human Rights to deal with it in any kind of spirited or way, but because careers and professions depend upon this, the fact that the whole exercise is beyond the rule of law and anonymous and allowing for injustice, one is actually compromising the whole idea of academic freedom, which I think is already completely compromised in Europe, and to the point where I think academic journals, international law journals, are hardly worth reading. I mean, I would only look at an article if it was written by somebody, this is where I'm going in total opposite direction, somebody I already know, whom I think has some kind of soul and who may well have managed to say something. So I do feel that the process is, there's some metaphors that one could use. Somehow or other, the goose has been choked and it's not laying any more eggs.
Yeah, that's a nice, that's a very compelling metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and as you said, then in that sense, peer review does not even meet the very terms of the field, the very terms the field has given to itself. It's all self-defeating from the start, and still very shocking. But yes, there is still this project of modernity of social sciences that hounds the whole business, and that hounds the very idea of scholarship.
Well, the idea of that there is an impartial and objective and value-free and non-subjective dimension, whereas I think I love your use of the word essay, that really an article expresses the personality of the author. Now, the author has to have a personality, and therefore there has to be something authentic about the article, and it's not simply a game in order to get an assistant professorship somewhere, which is in itself an understandable motivation. But I think in this dream world of Cambridge in the early 70s, when I was there, that we were personalities, and we were known to our teachers, the teachers are known to us. But you mentioned the sad demise of James Crawford in the last day or so. I believe he had up to 50 PhD students and gave them a remarkable amount of attention, according to his colleague Philip Allott. But it's still too much. It's still not possible to be placing each and every one of these students in a good context. And I think that comes down to the increasing mass quality of the university, the mass production of learning, these are issues which are beyond individuals to understand and beyond individuals to take responsibility for. But they are very, very serious.
No, and there is indeed this market and capitalistic aspect of things, and the mass production of lawyers and of articles.
Yeah. Which is why the peer review, blind peer review, is a robotization. It's a mechanization. It's a mass production method, and it is very problematic. In fact, you describe it even more darkly than I do. But I am convinced that prejudice is definitely a factor. I mean prejudice in the sense that the Germans, by Gadamer would say Vorurteile, that are their prejudgments that come from the personal perspective is still there, but it's not acknowledged and is operating in secret. And that is definitely contrary to the whole idea of freedom of speech and freedom of thought, that these things are not argued at in public. One doesn't get out of contradiction.
No, that's actually a very, very good point. I must say, I'm still surprised that the peer review process hasn't collapsed under its own weight, because it's a very demanding process.
Yeah.
You know, it needs to be fueled by us, and we are solicited all the time. And I'm just amazed that these journals continuously find the sort of human resources they need for this. And there are new journals every year, some more peer review process being conducted, and it's incredible that it's still standing on its feet.
Mm. Well, I think that we may come on to this in the course of our conversations, but I think there's a lot of things which are standing on their feet at the moment, which will not be standing on their feet much longer. There are unfortunate. Our planet is coming, unfortunately, to more crisis than just a climate change.
No, I fear so too, and maybe this is an opportunity for us to maybe move on a bit, in our conversation, and I know that you in the conversation we had preparing our little chat today, you said that the whole question of reviewing was actually raising a more fundamental question about scholarship. What is scholarship? What does scholarship and what does legal scholarship? And you said that we couldn't look at this whole reviewing practice without raising the question of scholarship, the purpose of scholarship and the achievements of scholarship. So would you want to share some ideas about how you understand legal scholarship?
Well, I think that the word scholarship itself supposes a tradition and a history. So it's not entirely unreasonable to expect an essayist to make some reference to what has already been said on that topic by others. I mean, we are within a tradition, we are within a history, but it's much more personal and subjective than the robotic blind peer reviewing would suggest. And here I think that there are at least two dimensions that occur to me. One is that our culture is, I think, in a very diffuse way, it's democratic and subjective. So subjectivity comes back through another pathway. And consequently, if one is doing scholarship, one is expected to be able to review and consider what everybody is saying. And the only form of legitimacy in a diffuse democratic culture is of public opinion and consensus. And so scholarship tends to be a matter of assembling opinions in order to work out whether there is a consensus. And while many people may object to being called postmodern, I think that our whole culture is postmodern in the sense that this is a review that doesn't go to foundations. It's not discursive. It's descriptive, and one is intended simply trying to find whether there is a coordinate, or whether there is a coincidence of opinion, out of which then will come some kind of notion of what would be right or what would be wise. I mean, it's not unrelated to a matter we could go into later about the nature of customary law and opinio juris, because I think they're connected. In the international law tradition, this goes back to probably to the founding of the Institut de Droit International in 1873, and the notion that the wise men of the Institute would be able to decipher what is the public conscience of the civilized world. But that then raises an issue that I have been exploring passionately recently in the light of the criticisms of this type of learning put forward by the Scottish philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, that this notion that there is a rational opinion of the civilized world that can be deciphered by, I won't say the word experts, but by a select few of learned and erudite people. This was the foundation, he said, of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And this connects very much with your anxiety about the equation of legal scholarship with scientific scholarship. And scientific scholarship being a concept that would cover also social morality and organization of public life. And at this time in high Victorian England, our late 19th century Europe, there was a belief that there was a homogeneous community, a civilized community, where rational people simply converged in their opinion. This opinion didn't have to be justified discursively, and it didn't have to be philosophically founded. It would simply arise. And we, I think, are caught by the international lawyers, and maybe scholarship generally has not caught up with developments in philosophy and literature, where it is recognized that with modernity, this whole homogeneous world has become completely fragmented. And I'm very, very impressed by there's a fellow called Eric Auerbach, and he has written a book called Nemesis, I think, and it's a study of realist visions in literature. And the last chapter is about Virginia Woolf and the voyage to the lighthouse. And she describes in this seminal and very brilliant novel, which is a bit more readable than others by, for instance, James Joyce is saying something similar in Ulysses, in that life from being made up of little separate incidents, which one lived one by one, became curled and whole like a wave, which bore up with it and threw one down with it there with a dash on the beach. And he's making the point, she's making the point in this seminal novel that really our concept of reality has become completely fragmented. Not in the sense of the romantic sense of being subjective and therefore valid because subjective, but simply in the sense that we are not able to perceive the whole nature of society, we're not able to comprehend it, and not able to communicate with one another. So, I mean, I often wonder whether the international lawyers who are close in their profession to diplomats, and I think especially on the continent, have a kind of proclivity to a kind of cultural or intellectual snobbery, whether they appreciate the extent to which the wider intellectual culture, especially of France, has been marked since the Second World War, not merely by existentialism, but by Samuel Beckett's famous play, Waiting for Godot. And I think every blind peer reviewer should be expected to watch an actual production of Waiting for Godot, and then they would realize the extent to which, when they are criticizing the work of these wretched young scholars, they are really talking to themselves. They are not actually, they're not even trying to talk to the person whose work they are reviewing. Not to mention the editors of the journal, who are usually ambitious bureaucrats with 20 or 30 other things on their plate besides editing journals, and really just want an automatic computerized way of dealing with their tasks. So I do think that MacIntyre does explain, he provides a philosophical foundation for what he's saying, that our society our individualist culture rests on the assumption that each individual person has their own collection of irrational beliefs, which they cannot really explain or justify to others, but somehow or other, miraculously in a democratic culture, a consensus or opinion forms itself. And that is what perhaps the peer reviewing is trying to chase. But that consensus, in my view, is really illusory. And in the sense that it is insubstantial, the content of it is not clear, but most of all, where it comes from is not clear. And so that is why I really admire this seminal little work of Baudrillard, Jean Baudrillard, in the shadow of the silent majorities, à l'ombre de la majorité silencieuse, I think is what it's called. A delightful little study. It's very pregnant, it's not completely clear, but it's the pathway that one needs to explore in order to understand just how sinister this process is.
It is sinister, Tony, the story you're telling us. I mean, let me maybe draw on one thing you said. I mean, I'd be keen on returning to MacIntyre because it's obviously controversial, but you draw this diagnosis that our concept of reality has now turned completely fragmented. We don't even have a concept of reality anymore. And I wonder whether there might be two ways to understand and possibly explain this. One way would be to say well, its modernity was doomed from the start. The idea that law, legal scholarship, legal writing has to be grounded in some sort of social reality. This was a project that was doomed to fail. Modernity, I mean, this is Sloterdijk, this is Lyotard. Modernity could never live up to its own standards. So that would be one way to look at it. I don't think this is the way you look at it, because this is a way where actually the scholar can get away without any responsibility for the mess, as you put it. So there might be another way, which is to say, and there it's something I borrow from Latour, which is that maybe critique has a share has a responsibility for this whole mess. I mean, in this article, has critique run out of steam? Latour raises the question: have people like us contributed to this loss of sense of any common understanding of reality? Have these sort of postmodern, self-labeled critical minds been instrumental to the rise of this loss of any shared understanding of reality? Which, because, and I think this second reading is possibly more interesting because it really points to our role. And when I say or, I don't mean a generic or. I mean people like us. Because Tony, let's be honest. The two of us have been firing quite heavily at some of the mainstream doctrines, some of the main discursive constructions at work in the field. Don't you think that we have contributed to this complete loss of a shared understanding of reality, as Latour may allude to it?
Well, I think that this is a point which I have come to think about more after spending, I think now 12 years, well, barring coronavirus, 11 years, the last year in London, in China. And I'm fascinated by, when we could come to this topic later because it's a very big topic, but I'm fascinated by the Chinese. I think I do understand where the Chinese, mainland Chinese, are coming from when they consider issues of freedom of speech and freedom of discussion. And they have a concept which is causing a lot of trouble in Hong Kong at the moment. But I understand where the Chinese are coming from. That criticism has to be sincere, and it has to be in good faith. And it has to be with what they call right attitude. And I have found myself in China, because I take very much what you say about both of us and in our work at one point. And I was reviewing yesterday or the day before an article by your colleague Manny Journet on French legal scholarship in the 20th and for the 21st century. I vaguely remember she sent me this article as an off-print, and I equally vaguely remember I never read it. But it popped up on Academia EDU and last week again, and I thought I would take a look at it. And she has a point there where she refers briefly in about 3 sentences to the decay of international law. And she says this is a scathing work. And she also says that, well, she says more about it, but she definitely doesn't like it. I think that where I'm coming from is a very conservative position. And this allows me to bring up again a second dimension that I had wanted to discuss, not simply the fragmentation of modernity, but the loss of any sense of history. If we have no sense of history, then how can we have scholarship? If scholarship is simply a matter of collecting the latest opinions that have come out in the last 3 or 4 years. And one often finds actually when one is making funding applications, one has to cite articles written in the last 5 years. You can't cite a seminal work, what you regard as a seminal work done 20 years ago. So there is actually a built-in contemporaneity, which I think is incompatible with scholarship. Now, I know that when I was a very young man, I went to Cambridge to do my PhD when I was 22. And I went into this beautiful Squire Law Library, which is now, I think, a museum. I mean, the Cambridge Law Library is now a horrible, modern kind of parking meter type place out in the suburbs. But the Squire Law Library was part of the original Senate building complex. And I was invited to simply spend 6 months there picking the books off the shelves. There would be virtually nobody in the library. And there were all of the, hundreds of international law books from the 17th, 18th, 19th century. And I was left free to read them. And I was encouraged to consider myself already as good as these authors, because I said to my supervisor, Clive Parry, I really am not awfully sure whether looking at history is useful, because I had come from Queen's University Belfast, which was dominated by left-wing socialist, sociologically oriented community lawyers who really had no time for history or the past. And Parry just laughed at me and he said, look, Carty, my boy, you are now a graduate student in Cambridge. Whatever you decide that you want to do, that's worth doing, because you are already a significant person. And I started to read this material and I became very nostalgic, because I realized that these people had souls, they had personality, and these books were, to use the expression you used earlier, they were essays. I mean, Vattel is writing an essay. It's supposed to be an elegant piece of work in which he sets out his spirit, his soul, how he sees the soul of Europe. And this created an immense sense of nostalgia for me and an immense sense of loss, when you then turn to the modern textbook. Sorensen's manual was all the rage at the time that Parry had actually contributed to. And I thought, this book is totally without any soul. What on earth is a state? What on earth is a legal personality? What on earth is this all about? I mean, there's no flesh and blood of the modern world society in this book. And we then criticized it. And then other textbooks, I won't mention them by name, but I mean, we know them all. It's the same character. So I really feel my own scathingness is a sense of loss. But I have become more optimistic that that world can be recovered. And China is a very paradoxical society, but it, of course, it has a Marxist regime, and that Marxism is not purely nominal. But it also has part of the official religion of the state. It is Confucian, and this Confucianism is a kind of classical philosophy. And actually, and this is where I think the West so completely misunderstands China, whereas I can understand that it may appear suffocating and authoritarian. But somebody like Xi Jinping actually whose thought, as he understands it, is Confucian, has to actually order the universities to read his work and to give it some attention and consideration, which for us Westerners is outrageous. If President Macron was to write some silly little book about the nature of France or the value of Napoleon, and then tell all the professors they have to read it, and it would go potty. But one has to remember that most of the professors in Chinese universities have been previously ordered to go to Europe and to study in Leiden and Utrecht and come back and talk like European international lawyers about the state of the world. And then you can see the whole thing is more complex. So at the moment, there is a row in Hong Kong about whether politicians should be elected if they are not patriotic. And for the West, it's perfectly clear that that is the crushing of democracy. But I think there may be some truth in that. There's always truth in every perspective. That's the whole idea of essay writing, I think. But I do think that the Chinese are onto something there, that how can you participate in a political process unless you have some sympathy for it? And I lived in Hong Kong for 6 years, and I would think that by and large, the pan-democrats have no sympathy for China or for the relationship between Hong Kong and China. So that is a really difficult area. Whereas I have not read Latour, whom you mentioned, but I think he's a key text, and I think we are responsible. And you are much more graphic than I am in your comment on the nature of the dangers of blind peer review, because I'm merely talking. I have spoken mainly of people who are blind to themselves and who don't understand where they're coming from, which I think is true of most people. And that comes on to the whole nature of professionalism. Professionalism is about acquiring objective external criteria for performance. It's not about the whole self in any kind of holistic sense, in my opinion. You have spoken much more about this sheer possibility of malignant and malevolent power-drunk conspiracy. I mean, we are all now post-Nietzschean, and Nietzsche is about destroying, and in my opinion, I mean, it's about much more than that, but there is a ferocity about him, which I think has penetrated academia to an incredible degree. So yes, I stand corrected, but with the qualification that it was a nostalgia for a lost world. Even the 19th century writers like Westlake and Holland, and in France, Fauchil and Bonfil, and in even Carl Schmitt is somebody I would put in the category of somebody from a bygone age. These people have soul, they have spirit, and I feel nostalgic for them and feel lost without them. So that is part of the. And then you turn up at modern so-called, I mean, Manu's article worships the technique and method, which was now all the rage, technique and method. But what on earth are these things? I have a lot to say about that, and we maybe come to it later. I think technique and method is just a fetish. French culture here has a great role for me to play, because Jacques Ellul, a French administrative lawyer, but also an evangelical Christian, he wrote a great deal about the mythology of technology in our modern culture, which relates to your very first point about that blind peer review is trying to follow some scientific method of objectivity. Definitely that doesn't exist. I mean, it becomes ridiculous in the British context because we have criteria which are very relevant to academic promotion and to funding, and we must be able to demonstrate. I have written a number of review reports for professorial candidates and professorial promotion in the last 12 months. And I am supposed to certify that a particular person is now world leading. What on earth is that, world leading? And we listened to Boris Johnson, our prime minister, telling us that our test and trace system is world leading, for dealing with coronavirus. I will say no more about that. So basically, we are caught up in vacuous concepts of competitiveness. Is this person world leading? Is this person virtually an Einstein, or is this person simply outstanding and internationally renowned? Or is this person simply somebody that you have heard about? I make nonsense of this nationally and locally, but not internationally. And the Research Funding Council, which is completing at the moment this research assessment exercise, actually qualifies its criteria by saying they are not to be understood geographically. And they say then, which I find extremely amusing, there could be somebody, for instance, in the University of Huddersfield or Nottingham in the Midlands of England, who produces a study of what's going on in Huddersfield or Nottingham, which is, in the sense that we understand it, world leading, even though of no immediate interest to anybody beyond Huddersfield or Nottingham. And they say this without any humor or self-irony. And this is in official Ministry of Education publications that are guiding the entire country, which is now, I think we may, I don't know how the extent to which this is the case in France, and I think it is already the case in Holland and Germany, that this bureaucratization of reviewing has now taken over the whole of university planning, the whole of faculty development, everything that has been done. There is another dimension there that Habermas outlines in his The Structure of the Public Space and the Bourgeois Society. Now, he's approaching from a Marxist point of view, but only in a very loose way. So as a Marxist, he attributes to the much more limited nature of the state in the 19th century and to the fact that many intellectuals, writers, politicians, and public figures had independent means and were not dependent on the state, and had also, but this may appear very conservative, also had a grounding in an intense family life, both individual family and wider family life. That this made it possible for the intellectuals or the writers or the essayists, because I think the essayists is the key word here, of the 19th century, about whom I'm so nostalgic, became so nostalgic in the Squire Law Library that they have some kind of soul, some kind of inner life, which they're expressing and communicating with one another. And obviously not in a destructive or aggressive way, because there is a kind of community of scholars operating there. And this is what he now says is totally disappeared, because we are in a corporate world of mechanical professionalism where there is no inner life at all in the exercises that people are engaged in. People are officials of one kind or another, completely dependent financially and for social esteem on the position accorded to them by what is essentially extended state bureaucracy. That certainly applies to the whole of academia, increasingly so.
No, and I can only agree with that finding. There is a book published a dozen of years ago by a person, Ginsberg, I think Benjamin Ginsberg. It's called The Fall of the Faculty, and he draws a little bit the same the same finding. He makes the same finding. He says, you know, law professors were too busy writing useless law articles and yielding to the law articles requirements, that they didn't want to put their hands in the dirt. They didn't want to take on managerial responsibilities, and then eventually they let the bureaucrats take over,
Yeah.
and the managerialists, and more generally just the managers. And the book is interesting because the author puts the responsibility on the academics for not doing their job because they were too busy trying to yield and comply with all the practices we've been discussing earlier, and that actually allowed the bureaucrats to take over. Well, I mean, this is a quite gloomy reading of things, and I think actually in you've been more positive than that. I mean, I've noted that you said that there was an amusing side of things, and I've also noted that you said you had nostalgia. So, and nostalgia means that there is still hope. Nostalgia is
Oh
not
yes.
hopelessness,
Oh yes.
and yeah, and maybe one way forward. And I'm saying this because we may have to bring this to an end, because even when we go we do try to produce interesting discussion with audiovisual materials. There are all kinds of constraints of the same kind as law articles. We want to bring this to a close and maybe leave it on a positive note. I think one way forward is as something you've repeatedly actually stressed is the return to the essay. And actually, there's a wonderful piece by Adorno on the critical value of the essay, and the idea that the essay is the only style that enables critical thinking and that takes writing seriously. And you know, personally, I've always been toying with the idea of launching someday a new journal, which is just, and not even journal. Journal would be the wrong term because it brings back the image of the law articles. But with some friends and colleagues, we've been discussing the possibility of launching something new where it will be just essays.
Yeah.
And I think there would be much to gain, to gain and to, in a way, regain the soul. You were always lamenting the loss of the
So,
soul.
yeah. And I was astonished to find that the clearest expression of this problem, which I summarize, a potted summary of it in my philosophy of international law, it comes from a Marxist from Habermas, and probably the end of the Frankfurt tradition. Maybe he picked up some of his ideas from Adorno. And I really find that very, very stimulating. I'm very anxious to go away and to read a little bit more about the nature of the essay. I'm speaking to you from a Victorian late, early Edwardian apartment in the center of London, the Morshead Mansions, and reading biographies of intellectuals of the late Victorian and Edwardian England, where they were all essayists, writing essays to one another and disagreeing handsomely with one another, but in a civilized and humane and non-destructive way. And particularly there was debates between the converted Catholic G.K. Chesterton and the atheistic George Bernard Shaw. And they could disagree and argue and discuss with one another in a very lively and spirited way. And when Chesterton died, Shaw was very close to the family and took great care that his wife was well cared for and well provided for. This was the spirit of the essay writing, though. I mean, for Chesterton, Shaw was a dark figure who was seduced by the spirit of Nietzsche and who really threatened terrible things for the future of the world. But it didn't stop the two of them engaging in this essay-like conversation with one another. And to my mind, this is something which should be and could be encouraged, but it would involve a revolution in the whole character of academic activity. But it can be explored much more. So I'm grateful to you for stressing this concept. Yeah.
No, and thank you, and also thanks for your wonderful reading recommendations, which I'm sure our viewers would appreciate. I think on the idea of essay, there is this book by Brian Dillon, Essayism, which I think to some extent makes a similar point. I think, Tony, I'm afraid we have to draw this to a conclusion. It's been wonderful, but before we wrap up, I want to say that we will be continuing our discussions, and we will be continuing recording our discussions. I think two major questions you have touched on will be the object of another conversation. I think we will have a conversation on history and the role of history in legal scholarship. I think we will also have a discussion on China and international law. It promises to be a difficult discussion, given how controversial this all is, but this is part of the plan. I think you've also touched on these ideas of fetishism for techniques. I think we may wish to add this to our list of discussion. I think this is pretty fascinating. So let's leave it here for now. Tony, I'm going to press the button to stop the recording, but thank you so much. It was really a wonderful moment, and we'll continue all this.
So thank you, Jean.